ask any questions. So we said, all right, we're going to have a course in asking questions, asking pertinent questions. And we organized paragraphs of information that had a certain coherence to them, but you could not understand the final sentences in the paragraph because we deliberately put something in there where the leap was erroneous and would require filling in a gap. And the kid's job was to sense where the gap was, articulate a question designed to retrieve an answer from somebody which would fill that gap. That's what good questioning means. It means to sense a gap, an unknown, designed to get an answer that will fill it in. And we built into the program giving wrong answers, which required the person to sense that you hadn't even understood the question. And they got sharp. They'd say, I'm sorry, you didn't understand the question. Maybe I said that, but I meant this, and they'd rephrase the question. They had to phrase that question so clearly that was designed to elicit the information that would fit that gap. Now that's teaching a kid how to think, but it's also telling him that it is possible to know what you don't know clearly enough to ask for something to fill it in. It gave them a whole new perspective on what schooling is all about. Now, it got some of them in trouble. So when these kids went back to the school in the fall, some of these kids worked nights, you know. They went to school all day and then they worked 8 hours at night. They'd have to be at school in the morning and they'd be tired. They wouldn't have time to study. So several of these students got so good at asking questions that they found, instead of having to read, in class during discussion, they could ask the questions and get the basic information and they wouldn't have to read. This irritated the teacher in the social studies. There was a social studies teacher and there were several of our upward boundaries in her class in junior year. And one of these students worked nights in the Holiday Inn bussing dishes. He didn't have time to study his history book, but in class he'd raise his hand now. And of course she knew of him before. He had a reputation in the school. He was a delinquent and had a record in the school. And so she said she wasn't going to answer any more of his questions. In fact, instead of those questions being regarded as pertinent questions, they were regarded as impertinent questions. And so the teacher had a few choice words for this kid, and to the effect that she didn't like federal tax money going into a program for the likes of him, whereupon he had a few more choice words for her in 4-letter syllables, which made him report it to the principal, and then the principal's administrative way of handling this is to suspend the kid for 3 days. So dumb. Here's the kid's behind anyway, or struggling to keep up. So you suspend him from school for 3 days, and now when he comes back, you think that's going to inspire him to catch up? Well, he got a C on the midterm test, which is something of a miracle. And they had a big argument about it. He argued that his answer on every test question, she wasn't used to having this kid argue anything. But he just had a sense of things. And, well, right after that, she was stricken down by some disorder. It was sort of, this kid thought it was the intervention of divine providence. And this teacher was taken out until the end of the semester. Whereupon we moved in the situation and got one of our student teachers to take over that class, who knew something about our Anisa approach in Upward Bound. And we said, look, for whatever you do, do not punish a kid for asking a question. Now, you might want him to hold it back and keep him from monopolizing the class because, you know, you always get those kinds of problems. But get them down into small groups and let them ask questions to each other, for heaven's sakes. So they really got this kid tooled up fine. And the teacher came back right at the end of the semester. She gave the final exam, and he got all the answers. He got an A on the final. But she gave him a B minus for the semester because she averaged in the midterm grade, even though the final was a comprehensive, that is to say, it covered material in the first half of the semester. Well, that was just dirty pool, as far as we were concerned, because if it's a comprehensive test, then you let that grade stand for the whole semester. You know, people have a way of being mean when they get a little power, and teachers feel sometimes the power is in the grade, you see, and so they use it in the wrong way. Well, we had to just counsel this kid. We said, look, don't let this get under your skin. Don't give her the opportunity of undermining your entire destiny. Just roll with the punch and carry on. But you see, when a kid is already tied up in knots and aggressive and has been given a raw deal in life, it's very hard for them to take this magnanimous, socially mature attitude towards things. Well, questions, I think, you get the feeling, are very important in the Anisa-Model. Teachers need to model it because it's good for children to do it, because it's a way for them to confront the unknown. But more than that, it enables teachers to collect information which is useful in diagnosis and therefore sharpens their prescriptions. Mag, do you want to add anything to that? If I'm leaving anything out now, you're supposed to poke me. Yes, what's the next thing?
Explaining. Well, you've tied it in.
Oh, let me talk about explanations. Anisa teaching style is essentially an explanatory style. And the explanation can come by demonstration and or by verbal talking, right? Explanation. One of the important elements in a good explanation is to find out what it is the child doesn't understand before you start the explanation. That's where the questions came in. Because if you just start explaining before you know what it is that isn't understood, you don't know where to place the emphasis in the explanation. And in fact, you may be saying things that is unnecessary to be said, or you may be saying the wrong things, you see. Robert Hess was at the University of Chicago, did a number of studies on maternal teaching styles, comparing lower-class mothers' teaching styles to middle-class mothers. And he found one of the chief differentiating characteristics in explanation. The study went something like this. They got a group of lower-class mothers, determined by socioeconomic status, and a group of upper or middle-class mothers. And they had a little puzzle that they taught the mothers how to work. And then the mothers had to teach their own child, which they brought, how to do this little puzzle. And I think the mothers were videotaped, or at least observed, and recordings were made of how they did it. Well, as I indicated, one of the chief distinguishing features between the two styles is the middle-class mothers had an explanatory teaching style, whereas the lower-class mothers had a dictatorial teaching style with very little explanation. The lower-class mother would display the materials to her child, but she wouldn't explain anything about it. She wouldn't even make clear what the objective was, which is a part of good explanation, you see. What is it you're supposed to do? After all, if you don't explain to a child what he's to do, then how in the world can you expect him to get on with it very well? Well, they just start. And, of course, the child wouldn't fare very well under such poor guidance, and the lower-class mothers have become impatient, and then they become cranky, and this upsets the child, who then doesn't want to do it anymore. This makes the mother madder, and finally she says, "Oh, you dummy, I'll do it myself." Well, if a child has 5 years of that before he comes to public school, he's not used to paying attention to an adult telling you how to do something because it's relatively foreign to his experience. In fact, a lot of those children come to school already having rehearsed and practiced inattention. They've learned how to tune out the nagging. And in fact, you know, in old people, there are a lot of old people who go psychosomatically deaf. There are just large numbers of psychosomatically deaf old men. And you know, they all are married to nagging wives. Or vice versa. Yeah, what you say? That's what they always say. Huh? Of course, if there's a juicy bit of gossip 500 yards away, they hear every syllable. But if it's this nagging going on, they can't hear it. They've already practiced tuning it out. And kids do the same thing. Now, obviously, a child who's had 5 years of that, when it comes to school, he is not on the same, he is disadvantaged. He does not have the same advantages as a child that comes to school who's had a mother who's had an explanatory teaching style. A couple of weeks ago, Don Streets had to take his little son, Nabil, to Children's Hospital because the child had a distended stomach and was having gastrointestinal difficulties of some kind. And this child had to go through a whole week of tests, so Don went there and stayed at the hospital. And his roommate was a little Jewish boy who had, I don't know if a finger had been lopped off or whatever, but there had to be a skin graft so that they had to take a patch of skin from the face or from the hand, and you know, you have to hold it here until the skin grows onto this one, and then you cut it off here, and then you peel it down, and it gets well. Anyway, the kid was in there for that. And he said, Dan, it was a wonderful experience watching that Jewish mama, the parents of that boy, come in and talk with him. Their whole time with him was not just idle chit-chat. It was one explanation after another of all the interesting things in that hospital and all the experiences that were going on, and reflecting on it and dragging every nuance out of every little thing that went on. And as a culture, the Jewish culture is explanatory in orientation about everything. And that's why you get a whole culture of kids with minds ready to grab onto anything, because you get it from the moment you pop out of the womb. Makes a difference. Makes a difference. And in the studies done on these maternal teaching styles, it was very clear that in just a moment, the minute the tension started between the mother and the child, because the child couldn't do it because the mother couldn't explain it, the emotional tension between the two blew the experience. And the kid is now saying, I don't want, describing like this. And you know how it's just infuriating. It's infuriating to have a kid like that, and you can appreciate the mother now wanting to just clobber him, which she did. But that's not designed to make him love learning. And so it goes, you see. You just can't expect the kid who's been treated with his mother like that for 5 years to now make it in school. Those kids are not going to become the Einsteins of the future on the average. Now, one or two might slip through, through some miracle, but by and large, you know, they're not going to do it. What's the next thing, Mag?
Well, there are several others. I think
but it's 3 o'clock.
Can't do though. Feedback, which is quite
feedback,
and humor, and so on and so on.
Okay, we'll do feedback and humor and whatever else is on Mag's list. When we come together on Monday, we're going to do memory mostly on Monday, but in the afternoon we're going to talk about the self. There'll be some time to talk about it. But we'll have a document for you. In fact, Mag is writing it together now, and she's just briefing me from the notes from the paper, and you'll have a lot of these things spelled out in the paper. Well, have a happy 4th of July, you all, and we'll see you on Monday. I hope I can remember to come back then, because that's the memory seminar. This session is going to be devoted to an exploration of what is known about human memory and show how it fits into the Anisa-Model. In a very basic sense, memory is the only evidence we have, ultimately, that learning has taken place. If I whistle a tune to you over and over and over again, you may now remember what the tune is, but the only evidence that we have that you learned it is that you are able to retrieve it somewhere in memory and reproduce it for us. So ultimately, that's what's necessary in order to demonstrate that learning has taken place. Thanks, Mag. Memories can be looked at from a variety of perspectives. There are some kinds of things that are stored in the memory that aren't very well connected with anything else and which can just be retrieved. There are other kinds of things stored in the memory that you can manipulate inside your head without doing anything on the outside. And that's the best kind of memory. A fluid organization that enables you to do things with what's inside your head, other than just taking it out and saying, here it is. And in a moment, I'll put you through a little exercise to demonstrate what I mean. There is, however, a difference between memory and learning, though the overlap is obviously there. And that difference is seen in the way in which we use the two words in our language. For instance, I've not met anybody who would say, I learned that I had toast for breakfast this morning. We wouldn't put it that way. We would say instead, I remember that I had toast for breakfast this morning. So one of the distinguishing differences which we operate on in the model seems to be that learning refers to some kind of relatively significant restructuring of experience or knowledge that gets stored. And that has to be remembered too. Whereas just plain memory, we refer to as just any item that gets stored, whether or not it requires any major reintegration or reorganization of things that are already there. Now, all of you have learned what a cube is, and you all know what cubeness, what the criteria for a cube is. But there will be differences in the facility with which you can deal with the phenomenon of a cube when it isn't present, when it's just in your head. And the differences among people in how they are able to do something with a cube in part depends on how you remembered what a cube is. And of course, that will be related to how many cubes have been in your environment and how intimate your interactions have been with it. So this little exercise I want you to do just now is really an exercise more for a child, because all of you will have had enough experience with a cube to be able to do something with the cube in your head when there isn't one out here. But even you, there will be differences in the speed with which you can do something with a cube inside your head. So I want you to just think for a couple of minutes on this little problem and then simply write down the answer when you get it. I want you to take a plain wooden cube of any size, which you should construct in your head, and paint the cube blue. You got it all painted now? That's the wonderful economy of doing things in your head. It's cheap, too. Now, I want you to trisect the cube. I want you to cut it this way, and this way, and this way. And tell me now how many unpainted sides of all the little cubes created there are. They don't hold still very well, do they? But anyway. You can't draw little pictures now. You have to do all this in your head.
Does it help if you're a blockhead?
Usually that's a deterrent.
Notice whose head he's looking at.
He could also be introspecting.
We hope he is.
All right, anybody want to say what the answer is?
Yes.
Yes?
18.
She says 18.
12.
18, 24, 12. Somebody said 16. How much?
27.
27. 28. Okay. Now, there are obviously, somebody's got to be wrong. Otherwise, you didn't paint your cube properly. Some of you maybe you didn't start out with a real cube. But I will construct a two-dimensional cube that has all the three-dimensional characteristics here. Now we're going to bisect it this way, and we're going to bisect it that way. That's two. And we're going to bisect it this way, and now we have trisection. Now you could go about finding out how many unpainted sides there are by taking one cube out, one little cube, and we see that there are 1, 2, 3 sides that are blue, and on the other sides there will be 1, 2, 3 unpainted sides. So you have 3 unpainted sides per cube. Now there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cubes. So 8 times 3 is 24, and that's the right answer. There will be 24 unpainted sides of the cubes that are left. Now, I thought you'd all get it right. So I was very glad that you didn't, that I know some of you just didn't get it right to help me out. To show you that people will hold in memory experiences with varying degrees of accuracy. And the more experience they have with something, the better off, or the more likely they are to be able to do something with that stored experience in the way of an internal manipulation, which is what this is. Now, I would be interested to know how the ones who said 24 arrived at that. Who got 24? I know several of you did. Yes. How did you do it?
I went about it the same way you did.
Yes?
As far as first I counted up there were 6 sides of the cube all the way around and I figured out how many were painted.
Yes. How about you?
Well, I figured that 2 cuts from the top made 4 blocks.
Yes.
Pieces, and then the lateral one made 8. And then each side, each painted side, there were 3 exposed surfaces, so there were 3 units.
How about you, Gail?
Each slice made 8 unpainted sides.
Sides. And 3 slices? Yes.
I
can't hold all those little cubes and remember how many sides I have.
Ordinarily, on an exercise like this, two categories of people tend to get it right quickly. Those who are mathematicians and therefore have worked with cubes in an abstract sense, or those who are highly visually oriented and therefore have good visual memories. And what they do is that they just see themselves taking each cube off and counting the sides and putting it down more or less. That's a little more laborious way. If you don't have good visual memory and you haven't had much math experience, you'll tend to get befuddled as you try to manipulate your internal experience, what you remember in essence of a cube. Well, I now want to engage you in another kind of experience, which we're an experience in memory, which from which we will then collect some data, and then we will analyze the data together and use that analysis as a way of getting into some things about memory. And Ed, this is going to involve getting up and walking around, so I think we might as well just shut the videotape down now. Something. They need to know how much there is that's expected of them. And this in itself will facilitate the memory. Well, we're going to collect some data from you now and use those data to get into a discussion of memory generally. And you will see that some items will have been remembered better than others. And I'm going to explain to you why that's the case. Now, I have predictions, and my predictions may be off, but my predictions are based on a theory, and we'll see how they check out. I'm just going to give the item, and then how many got it. And Mag, will you help me count? How many did not get the white box? Did you get it, Mag? I got 24. Did you get it? Did you get the white box?
No. I saw it and I remember now.
Of course you remember. Too late.
But I know something else about it.
Sure. Yes, it said 716, it's on the outside. Well, I would predict that more people would miss the white box than anything else. Now I'll tell you why in a moment, but I think my theories are working out. You're all behaving so well this morning. I haven't put them in order, incidentally, but I just wanted to start off with that one to give myself a burst of confidence in it. And this is how many didn't get it now each time. Blue pencil. Okay, how many didn't get the blue pencil?
Did it have to be blue?
No, well, you just have to say pencil.
Oh, no, I wouldn't know. Sorry.
Yeah, didn't get it. This is like a confessional, right? You're confessing your sins each time, not your virtues. Next one is the large green candle. How many didn't get it? 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7.
And I thought I wrote candle, but it was the green candle I was thinking.
All right.
And I didn't get the little candle.
Yes, all right. You know which candle you remember. All right. Small pink candle.
I said birthday candle.
Yeah, that's good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Blue and white stripe.
Next, staples. Keys.
Oh, Jesus, damn, I
Oh.
forgot these. Oh, I didn't get
Wait, I forgot. Sorry, I missed that one. There's a little blue pen cap. It comes out pretty well. It's exactly what you would think. What? Now, Mag, would you take that information down for me so that I have it, or maybe you can't see it. So
I can do it, Meg. I'm here.
would you take it down? Just take down the information.
Keep my eyes around that way, I really be doing a visual.
Discrimination exercise. All right, now I want to just make a few comments about this, and for the rest of the morning we'll be referring to, off and on, to this experience.
Make a comment before you make a comment.
Yes.
People in group 1, 2, and 3 had 90 seconds more than we did in group 4.
Yeah, that's right. But we also know from research that what the time decay is for memory exercise of this sort. And no matter how long you sit, if you do not know how many items there were, the probability of you having a time advantage is very remote. In other words, we could do a little exercise right now and find out if your thesis is true. You might get one or two people doing a little bit better because they had more time. But I gave everybody the main amount of time before the memory curve just dropped off like that. So we could actually take the group 1, who had the most amount of time, and total the number of items they remembered, and group 2 and group 3 and group 4, and we'll just check out your thesis. I would expect group 1 on the average to maybe have a slight advantage, but we should not find a statistically significant difference. So we just check out the thesis. What I want to do for group 1 is to get the numbers remembered. And we just add up the total items. I think that would give us the best perspective.
No, there's 2 more people in groups 1 and 2.
Oh yes, that's right. Well, what we could do is get the average. That would be the way of doing it. Who was in group 1? Do you remember your group, Gail? Would you get a piece of paper and just go around and figure it? And you're group 2, right? Would you just go around and collect the data and make the average? And you're group 3, and you're group 4. You remember the members of your group? Well, if you go around the room, well, no, you wouldn't know necessarily. If he was group 1, you couldn't be group 1.
You're gonna take that.
How many counted the number of items when they were there?
I
Now,
didn't get the right amount.
what?
I counted 24, but I just did a real quick count.
Yes. Well, could we find out whether or not you were above or below the average?
I was below. No, I was average.
Your average. Now, let's take 56 as the average. If we average these, let's say we come out there. I think that'd probably be about right. I want to know whether you're above or below the average if you counted them. Just for a quick check.
Above.
Above. Okay, that's one up. This is above, this is below. We got one above.
Below.
Below. Above.
Below. I don't really think that I had enough time to write down my things.
Yes, she was severely socially disadvantaged and deprived. Yes, above. Of course, it may be that those who are naturally brighter count anyway, and so therefore you would expect them to have higher memories. But the thesis generally holds, but I don't know whether it would be 2 to 4. That's probably on a Fisher exact probabilities test would give you, I think it would give you significance, but not probably at the 0.5 level or at the 0.10 level. The point here, though, is that supposing ordinarily this would be your memory on a histological graph, or if you didn't count, and if you counted, you would get that many. If you got a very poor memory, and if you counted, you'd get this many. And if you had an excellent memory and you counted, you'd get that many. So that this kind of I've seen people in the room to see if there's anything that will remind them of something they saw out there. Now those people are bound to, by association and so on, generate more possibilities. Well,
It's interesting though, Dan, I came back, after you asked us to write down the things we didn't have, more than half of those things I didn't even see. I mean, some of them I said, oh, I saw that and didn't write it down. Now, what caught me to write it down?
well, I would think that the majority of you would not have felt any one of these names I called out a mystery. Maybe 1 or 2, but by and large, most of you said, oh. And that just shows something we're going to discuss shortly, namely the difference between research and recognition. In other words, you knew that you had seen it once I said it, but you couldn't recall it. You could only recognize that you knew it. But would any of you seriously challenge that these items were, that any of these items was not there? I don't. Yes.
I didn't see them all.
You didn't see what?
No, I didn't see them all. I never saw any matches.
Yeah, I didn't see
And something else, never saw.
I didn't see a blue pen.
I mean, I can't say that I recall something serious, but I remember more clearly everything on the left side of the table and vaguely the things on the right side of the table.
That's interesting. Well, that would be something to check out because of the way the eye is structured. You may find things in the left. Was it the left visual field that you? Well, it could. That would be something interesting checking out. Now I want to talk for a little bit about why some things were more likely to be remembered than others as a way of getting into a discussion of memory. The reason the white box, I would predict, was of no significance. If I had opened the box and put something in it, this would have increased greatly the probability of you remembering it. But the white box never directly connected with anything else on the paper. Therefore, it didn't get integrated into the experience. Now, what you will find throughout our discussion, the differentiation, integration, and generalization, as you might expect, are the keys to good memory. And if the way you store information integrates that information itself is integrated, and secondly, it's integrated with something you've already done and known, that boosts up the likelihood of an accurate memory enormously. Now, I've arranged these items in such a way that once you got one, had you made connections when you were looking, you would have gotten the other. So that when you have a memory task, hunt for connections. If you try to think of them all as differentiated elements alone, memory will go way down. But if you examine connections, then once you get one, it will lead to the next. And if that one is connected to something else, you get the next. And if you've got connections among most of them, or in groups of them, you'll be able to manage it. We know from research that it is very difficult to remember on an exercise like this more than 7 things that are unconnected. It is possible to get 26 right if you group them in some way in no more than 7 groups. Now, for instance, you will find that classification, which is a form of differentiating things, but abstracting common attributes that would enable you to put them in a class, facilitates memory. That's one of the chief facilitators of memory. For instance, if you had the class of office supply objects, and you picked out all those things and made a connection, then you would have gone right around. So you have a rubber band, you have a paper clip, you have staples, you have a pencil. Then you have 2 kinds of pins. If you got one kind of pin, all you have to do is pin and attach 2 to it, put it in the class of office supplies, and you have both pins, the map pat and the T-bar pin. There's a letter opener, which is an office supply thing. But there are 2 kinds of openers. There's a bottle opener and a letter opener. All you do is put opener, attach 2 to it, and you know that once you get one opener, you get the next opener. Then you might look at carpentry type things, so that once you get one screw attached to, you get bolt. What goes with the bolt? A nut. So once you got one of those, the other 2 automatically come if, when you were looking at it, you made the connection. So people who are busy just looking around and not making connections will have a poorer memory than those who see what connections are and rehearse the connections just for that brief time. What'd you say, Ruth?
That's what I did.
What?
I just looked around.
Yes.
And it's interesting what you say about the T-bar pin and the other kind of pin, because I remembered the other kind of pin, but the T-bar pin to me was an upholstery pin because I sew.
Yes. But then that
So
would have been
I put it with office supplies.
Sure.
I put it with something.
But if it were an upholstery pin, then that would have attached to the patch of material.
But I didn't practice on it.
See, there are multiple connections, and you in your own life will have made different kinds of connections than I'm suggesting here. And I'll tell you what some other people have told me how they do it. But this is how I put the objects together myself. Keys are very much a part of an office kind of thing, because you open up the desk, and when you open it up, you find all these office things in it. Now, once you got a pink candle, you should have got green candle. And once you got green candle, you should have had pink candle, because you just attached 2. Now, candles are something that you light, and you light them usually with matches. So if you made the connection between candles, the 2 candles, that should have led you to the match. Now, when you light the candle, you get light, and that should have led you to the light bulb, because it makes light. Now, you may have established a general category of rectangular shapes, in which case you would have got the patch of material, the calling card, and the credit card, because they're all the same size, and they all have a rectangular shape. So if you just said rectangular 3, then once you got one of them, this would have generated the other 2 very quickly.
And the box.
And the box too, yeah. That's about the only connection. But the box is 3-dimensional in the sense that it's thicker and fatter, and therefore it tends not to get associated, but could easily. The string, there's the wick in the candles are made out of strings, and therefore once you got candles or matches or lights, it should have led you to the string. Or if you classify string as office supplies, it would have gone in that category. And if you had done it quickly and saw 8 office supply items, just put office supply 8 and rehearse them quickly, that would have increased the probability greatly. Let me see how many people missed a watch. 13. I would have expected that to have been I've always thought that people would get a watch much more quickly, but I deliberately, it doesn't tie into anything else very directly. And I find these days a lot of people don't wear a watch, and they like to be oblivious of time somehow, and so more people miss it than I always predict. I always find that people get the credit card. That's a very high priority item. The difference between white box and credit card is enormous. Of course, the credit card can do so much more for you in life than at least immediately. One person organized a story to connect the items. She saw a man in a houndstooth suit, which was the patch of material, going to the car and using his keys. And he had a wallet and a credit card in his pocket to go down to the hardware store and the office supply store to buy a list of things. And he lit up a cigar, and he used the matches, and the cigar was as shaped as the green candle, and that triggered the green candle. And just by virtue of spinning this fantasy very quickly of this story, got a lot of the items. That's a rather unusual way for people to remember something. This happened to be a musician, incidentally, who also was very much interested in poetry. Now, one of the exercises you can do with young children to get them in the habit of connecting things that don't come connected, because a child has to be in charge of constructing his own best memory, but you have to teach him how to do it. And the way you do it is to make sure that he gets the integrations, and if you're not making them, he has to know he has the responsibility of doing it. And one way to get some exercise, which is very interesting, is to provide a number of unusual objects, 5 or 6 objects, and have the child construct a story that connects them. And if you do this over a period of time, he'll get very used to spinning out a story that will connect these objects. And you can use it as a means of building the vocabulary for the child too. But it very clearly lets him know that a way to connect things, the way to remember things, is to store them connected. If they're stored differentiated, memory goes way down. Okay, I'm going to be making some reference to these, to this little exercise as we go on.
I'm going to say something about
Yes.
these people who hallucinated. I, for example, saw something that I said, this was my last item of stretching, something round and shiny like a dime. But it may have been the penny, I don't know, but that was how I remember it. Now that's a hallucination because it wasn't.
Well, no, I suspect it was the penny. It could have been the penny in the button. Now, if you were interested in shapes and you put down rectangle, you would have gotten the patch of cloth and so on. If you'd put round, you could have gotten the penny, the
I
iota,
hate to admit it, that I
the
didn't
button.
recognize anything. Did it random.
Well, randomization is the chief enemy of memory, and organization and integration is the chief facilitator of memory. Now, I'd like to have anybody volunteer who would like to say how they made the connections, if they remember. See, if you didn't know about how to do it, chances are you would have just looked and tried to walk very quickly in and get down and write it all down before you stubbed your toe and it all went. Because it wasn't very well, and what you're doing, as you will see, is you're rehearsing things that are only in short-term memory, soon to go. Yes?
What I tried to do was to take that section and split it up into 4 parts.
Quadrants.
Yes, and then remembered what was in this part, and this part, and this part, and this part.
That'd be one way of doing it, yeah?
This is interesting. I didn't have the white box. But the first thing I saw was the white box. And I tried to put as many of the smaller objects in the white box.
And then you forgot the box. Have you ever gone fishing without the tackle?
I hate the fish.
You hate your fish. That's because he always forgets the tackle, right? No. That's interesting. Because of course, I mean, I never thought of that connection, but that is a logical connection. But I find that most people forget the box. But it's curious, once I say the box, most people say, oh, 7/16. For some reason they remember that there is a number on the box. And you would have thought that would have somehow triggered it, but for some reason it doesn't. But I never thought of opening up the box, because there are a lot of items that are tiny enough that would actually fit in that box. Yes?
My experience has taught me that if I put a name, if I had said, that is a candle, that is a blue candle, that is a pink candle, if I could have done that with a list, I would have had a higher recall. And my experience also says that if I had written those down and even thrown the piece of paper away afterwards, I would have had even a better recall.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And if I could write it in my mind, even if I couldn't write it.
That's right.
For example, if I have trouble with a name, and if I can visualize it, I will remember that name afterwards. But if I can't, if I don't have time to do that.
Yes. Yes, Debbie?
I had this is strange because it was about 4 or 5 objects that were there, and I thought about them, and I couldn't remember if they were really there or not. And so I didn't put them down where I probably should have. The
Yes, you should have.
And the box and the letter opener. I knew what it was. I knew the shape, and I didn't put it down because I wasn't sure it was there after. But it must have been after we went over it. It actually was.
We sat here and thought of things that would be there if you were rounding up things to put on the table and everything like this. And that gives you quite a few.
Yes, it gives you quite a few, right, exactly. Yes.
I used a mnemonic device, like tried to make every item construct a sentence from it, like be. I use the word be to mean blue pencil, careful to mean candle, poor I used to mean penny. I made a sentence out of it.
Yes.
And then also I never saw the paper clip, but figured, like Gail said, that there were elastics and office supplies there, so I just threw a paper clip down.
Yes. Yes, that's it. Extrapolate and make a good guess. How about you?
Well, I went with the office supplies, kind of.
Yes?
I tried to alphabetize, but there's some that I didn't know. Like, I didn't know that those were screws or nails or whatever. And I think I got sidetracked on trying to figure out what they were.
Yeah, they don't fit in the alphabet if you don't know what they are. Yes. Anybody else? Well, a thought just came into my mind, but I lost it. Let's see if I can retrieve it. Because now I'm intrigued by something to do with what you said.
There's one technique that I learned in a memory course. Well, it wasn't really a memory course, but that you learn a list of visual cues, and then if you want to remember a list of items, you team up each of the items with that visual cue, and it recalls the item for you because the list of cues is memorized.
Yep. Well, as you'll see, one of the important things in increasing the accuracy of memory, or just making sure that you got one in the first place, is to put an address on the item before you file it. See, if you have a lot of papers in your office and you don't have a system for tagging an address on it when you put it away, of course, when you're hunting for it, you won't know where to look, which means you now have to rummage through this whole place hunting for the piece of paper. You've all had that experience, I know. Whereas if you had a system of filing it, you put an address on it and you know the address system, and therefore you put it there and you can find it when you want it. What I was going to do a minute ago when I had the temporary lapse of memory was to ask what items were hallucinated. I'd like to get an idea of what items were on your list that were not out there. Yes?
Greeting card.
A greeting card.
Green.
Oh, a green card. Uh-huh. Well, there's a blue card, but a green candle. I don't know if
I got the green candle.
You got the green
but
candle.
The green card.
Yes, Eileen?
When I saw you look for some chalk, And then he went out. I said, ha, there was chalk out there and he's gone to get it. So I wrote down chalk because I was sure I saw it.
Of course, you saw some things about that size and shape and writing stuff. How about you?
I knew there was a penny. I was pretty sure there was a nickel. And I thought maybe there was a dime.
Almost days. Are you facing unemployment? No. All right. Well, none of us know whether we are or whether we aren't these days. Who else? Who else?
I guess it would come to that category. I remembered something of the shape of the pen top on the material patch. I remember the material patch, and I drew the shape that was on it. I couldn't remember that it was the blue pen top that was on there.
Yeah.
I thought it was more like one of the screw, a screw or something like that. That might be on there, but I couldn't.
Well, I didn't mean to have it on any item on top, but I think when I moved the paper off, I must have distributed.
That was confusing. Putting one item on top of
Yes.
another.
Yeah, I didn't
There was
intend to
something
do
over
that.
the string too, I believe.
Well, that was the screw, and that helps me remember that for some reason.
Anybody else hallucinate? I would find it very unusual if you thought there was a frog out there, or a cucumber, or something like that. And when we talk about forgetting, you will find that forgetting is largely a form of confusion. And that confusion has to do with associations. And therefore, once you see the penny, you see the nickel, and now you see a quarter, and now you're not sure whether there was one or whether there was three. But it's very unlikely that you would hallucinate something terribly unassociated with anything that was out there. I'd be very surprised, unless you could be a very creative person if you did, because you would be capable of remote associates. You know, you have to really go 10 times away before you associate with something. All right. Yes.
You said forgetting is a form of confusion. I'm not sure I know quite what you mean.
Well,
Forgetting what? You mean?
she was
cards
sure there was a
dismissed?
green card out there, and she got cards with green.
Oh, the hallucinating. Okay.
Well, yes. In other words, then, you in a sense will say, well, oh, I forgot there was something out there, and that's because you confused it with something else. Well, and we're going to discuss the nature of confusion a little bit later. All right, now I want to give you some of the hard-nosed stuff that we have on memory, with that little experience as a background. If you want to have a little book that's nice to give you a quick overview, it's called Introduction to Human Memory, A Psychological Approach by Michael Howe, put out by Harper and Row. And reading a little book like this would give you all kinds of ideas of things that you could do with children to make them aware of memory and of memory processes. It's Michael J. A. Howe, H-O-W-E. It should be no surprise to you that since we define learning competence as the conscious ability to do these things, that you can increase the power of memory by being consciously aware of the things that improve it, as you are actually engaged in the task of remembering something. So that general principle of the model carries through to that. I want to look at three basic kinds of memory phenomena just for a moment. One is called the sensory register. One is called short-term memory, and the other is called long-term memory. There are many ways to organize perspectives on the phenomenon of memory. This might be called a time perspective. The sensory register refers to a lingering trace of sensory input that lasts for a fraction of a second. For instance, when you look at something, look at this for a moment, and then close your eyes, and for 1/2 second after you close it, there will be a trace of what was on the board, or look at anything else in the room. You'll be able to hold what you saw for just a split second. Try it for just a minute. Just look at something and then close your eyes, and you'll be able to see for just a split second that it's still there, and then it goes. That kind of memory is called the sensory register, and it's a phenomenon which has been pretty well demonstrated, and there are enough physiological evidences for it, because it takes a little while for the nerve impulse to reach, say, the occipital lobe from the eye. So when you close the eye, a nerve impulse is still on the way, which carries the message of what was seen. And even after the eye is closed, that message is still going there, and therefore you will get it after the eye is closed, but not for very long. And that's true for anything. If you pinch your hand, just take your hand here and pinch it pretty hard and let go. And you will see that in that case it lingers for quite a while. And this is largely because it takes a little while for it to resume its normal shape once it's been pinched with this very direct mechanical stimulation. And therefore there will be nerve impulses that continue going to the motor cortex. So there is a lingering sensory register, and it will be longer, the sensory register, for the skin than it will be for the eyes or for the ears. If I give you a sequence of numbers, the minute I stop saying it, you will still hear it for a moment. 3, 2, 6. Just for a little while, you can still hear my voice saying 3, 2, 6 before it goes. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because that's pretty well been demonstrated. I now want to talk about short-term and long-term memory because there's a lot of conflict between the two in the research. But yet there seems to be enough evidence to justify the belief in the existence of long-term and short-term memory. Let me just cite the evidence that leads us to believe that there are two separate kinds of memory here, one dependent on the other. First of all, the short-term memory decays very fast, and long-term memory seems to stay around forever. You would think that if they were both exactly the same, that everything would fade quickly or everything would stay around forever, but they don't. Some things just come and go very quickly, and other things stay for indefinitely. So that the durability of storage, marked difference in the durability of storage of experience, seems to justify the existence of two separate kinds of memory mechanism, short-term and long-term. Number two, there seems to be two kinds of forgetting. Well, lots of kinds, but two kinds here. One which relates to long-term and one which relates to short-term. For instance, acoustical similarity will increase forgetting in short-term memory, whereas associative interference or semantic similarity or interference will upset long-term memory. By semantic, I mean meaning kinds of things. We're pretty certain that long-term storage or long-term memory is organized around meaning, or perhaps a more direct way of saying it is, of saying the same thing is, nothing gets into long-term storage unless it's well connected to other things, and it is those connections and some total of them ultimately, and that's what we're ultimately talking about when we say meaning. When you define a word, and then you say you now have the meaning, you define that word in terms of other words that you know. And then every word that you use to define that word will be defined in terms of other words that you know. So that meaning seems to inhere in the pattern of connections among things. And this is the chief characteristic of long-term memory. And if meanings, that is to say connections, are similar, they can get confused. And if they're confused, then we experience what we call forgetting. And that seems to only be the case with long-term memory and not short-term memory. And that's another reason for thinking that there are two kinds. Another set of studies showed that if there is a high arousal stimulus, it gives poor immediate recall, but there is good long-term effects and vice versa. There's so many exceptions to this one that I think this is one of the weakest justifications. But in very severe cases, you know that if you have a severe trauma, there will be no recall of the immediate events after it because it's traumatic. And you wouldn't remember it later, and you wouldn't remember it right then either. So that kind of experience, there's a point at which this high arousal thesis does not operate, because if it gets too high, it knocks out both short-term and long-term memory. And although it doesn't knock it out, it just makes it hard to get an address file on it, so you can't retrieve it. The effect of repetition seems to show a difference between the two. For instance, what you learn first in a sequence of things tends to get to affect long-term memory, whereas what you learned latest has an effect on short-term memory. For instance, and this carries on into long-term memory generally. For instance, if you, in my case, if I come in the morning and park my car in a certain place, and then I go out to lunch and take my car and park it in a different place, when I come out in the evening, I always hunt for it in the place I parked it in the morning, and not where I parked it when I came back at noon, which meant that primacy operates in my memory better than recency. Now, I know that about myself. If we agree to meet at 8 in the morning, and then 20 minutes later, somebody comes and says, look, could we meet at 8:30 instead? I've got something cooking at 8. I say, okay, I'll show up at 8. Because that was the first arrangement. And primacy, and people have different characteristics. There's some people who only remember the most recent thing, and not the first thing. In terms of capacity, short-term memory is able to handle, on the average, no more than 7 unconnected items. For most people, it's 5. So we can say 5 to 7 unconnected things is all you can manage in short-term memory. Now, the reason why that's important to remember is that if it doesn't go into short-term memory, it can't get into long-term memory. Everything goes through short-term memory. Therefore, whatever short-term memory can't handle, long-term won't get into long-term memory. On the other hand, the capacity for long-term memory, we have not been able to place the limits on it. And this is one of the chief bits of empirical evidence supporting our philosophical position of the infinitude of the potentialities of man. Because a new experience can always be stored some way, shape, or form in memory. And there seems to be no limit to this so long as there has not been a deterioration of brain tissue itself. In other words, as long as you're eating well, there are no toxins in the brain cells haven't been destroyed, and you're getting enough sugar, we have no way of placing a limit on human memory. Now I want to talk about some physiological evidence, which is even more telling. There seems to be a place in the human brain that is necessary for things to go from short-term memory into long-term memory. And if you remove that part of the brain, long-term memory is no longer possible. These studies on the arrangement, the anatomical structuring of the brain and its relationship to memory phenomena came about by a number of accidents, some of which occurred during the war when soldiers came back with shrapnel embedded in their scalps. And shrapnel had to be removed, and therefore chunks of the brain got removed. And then there were examinations to see what the memory loss was. A more perhaps important source of these studies centered around epilepsy. We mentioned last week that the brain, the cortex, has about 14.5 billion nerve cells, neurons, cerebral neurons, and that each of these stores a charge and fires it 14 to 15 times a second when you're awake. And there is the theory that the pattern of these firings is where memory lies, and therefore if you destroy the patterning, then the memory goes. It's true that in certain parts of the human brain, if you remove a section which governs the patterning of the firings, then the memory goes, and there is permanent damage. In other areas, you can remove up to 35% of the brain, the cortex, and have no real drastic impairment of memory and experience. And therefore, it looks as if some memories are not localized in a given spot, and that other memories seem to inhere in the pattern of firings. If you remove this part of the brain, you go blind, and a lot of visual memory goes, but not all. You will have a recollection, even though you've become blind, of what things looked like. And it may fade over time, but you'll have a fairly decent idea about it. If you destroy these areas, if you destroy this area, you become paralyzed. If you destroy this area, touch and feel may go, and therefore some of the memory, but not necessarily. People who are paralyzed may nonetheless recall what it felt like to jump, so that the memory of jumping is still there, and they may rehearse all the sensations of it. And that's because here, if you're destroying the motor cortex, that's the part of the brain that sends the impulse volitionally down to your leg to make it move. But if the nerves in the leg are destroyed, then the leg won't move, even though the brain may be sending the impulse down. And furthermore, if you've got a very long nerve, some nerves may be 3 to 4 feet long. And if things are destroyed at the end, and the head of the nerve cell is still up here, if you cut it off, you may get mechanical stimulation of this nerve, and it goes up to the brain, and the brain will project it back down to the limb that's cut off. This is a phenomenon known as phantom limb. I had a friend in whose little band I played when I was an undergraduate, and he had fallen before a trolley, and the trolley severed his leg above the knee, so he had crutches. And I played in his little band, and every now and again he'd put his ukulele down or his guitar down, and he'd take his crutch and he'd bang it on the floor about right there. And this always seemed kind of strange to me. So one day I said to him, Mel, why do you always grab your crutch and scrape it around and bang it on the floor? He said, well, my foot itches. I said, oh. I said, your foot itches? I didn't know how far we should carry this conversation. He said, yes, have you ever heard of a phantom limb? I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, and he explained that if you get your leg cut off, there are some nerves from here that go still up to the brain, and if the stump or something gets tired or fatigued or stimulated, it will send if the nerve that originally terminated in the big toe gets stimulated even though it's at the knee, the message to the brain is that the toe is itching. And he says, he said, oh, I know it doesn't really do all that much good. It makes me feel a little bit better if I just scratch this imaginary toe. And it sometimes makes it go away, because in past experience, if your toe itches and you scratch it, the itch goes away. And therefore, if you have an imaginary toe and you give it an imaginary itch, maybe it'll go away. So memory can play some interesting tricks on you. And I've done some experiments with congenitally blind people. I know a girl who was born blind, and she got very interested in writing poetry, and her poetry is filled with visual imagery of colors. Red this, and the beautiful blue sky, and the green trees, and the bright red flowers, and so on. So I asked her once I got to know her very well, what is red to you? Well, she has a totally non-visual conception of red. And every one of these colors has an alternative set of descriptors that has nothing to do with color as we know it. For instance, she said, well, red is active and warm, and blue is calmer and cool. And of course, she's picking up statements about these colors which people have given in the imagery, but there is no way that this child could know redness or blueness or greenness. She never had it. Now, to give you another idea of the incredible associative connections from a physiological point of view, there were a number of interesting studies done on children with congenital cataracts who later had their cataracts removed at the age of 6 or 7. Now, we know that if there is not the experience of patterned light, or some kind of light, in the retina for the first few months after birth, there is terrific degeneration of visual ability, and become legally blind for all intents and purposes. But with cataracts, you do get light into the retina, and that keeps the eye alive and going. It's just that you can't see anything because everything is opaque and diffuse. It's a little bit like looking through frosted glass. You can see the light, but you can't really see, you couldn't read a letter through that, or you couldn't recognize anybody particularly through it. Well, David O. Hebb at the Montreal Neurological Institute found a small group of children who were born with cataracts, and whose parents took them to an ordinary practitioner who just claimed them blind, and that was that. And they came from poor families, so they didn't get any adequate medical attention. And so the idea of removing the cataract surgically did not occur until the children were 6 or 7 years old. It was a very interesting experience for the children who had lived 7 years without sight to suddenly get it. It introduced enormous confusion into their lives because they had nothing to connect a visual experience with. Now, he showed these children triangle, circle, and a square. They all knew what triangles and circles and squares were. They'd worked with them. They had blocks that shape. They could identify, just put one in their hands and they'd tell you in a minute what it was. When they first saw them, they couldn't say what they were. And they said, well, they asked them, which one of these is a triangle? One of them said he'd pick the middle one. They're just a random distribution. In other words, until you could get a connection between the feel, which was their chief modality of experience with the figure, get a cerebral connection with the visual input, there was no way for them to know that this is a triangle. They had to have the fact pointed out that these are points, because visually they had no experience of identifying a point yet. And they had to be able to manipulate and handle and have these points pointed out to them, and that these have no points, that this is round, and associate roundness and the feel of roundness with what was going into the eye before they could remember what they were. So you can see the importance of manipulation for early childhood in order to get the association areas of the brain working. In fact, a huge percentage of the brain is given over to association areas. These areas are the areas that connect hearing with seeing, with feeling, with touching. And you can actually see them when you analyze the brain. They're just like, well, they're just like sheaths of cables going from the temporal lobe, which is the seat of hearing, to the occipital lobe. And we can even trace the impulses in the brain required when a child learns how to read, because he's decoding from vision first to sound and then to stored meaning. Yes?
What happens in the reverse situation? Say a child is a quadriplegic and can't manipulate things physically, they can only see them. Is there any kind of...
Well, he would, I mean, there would be no way of really testing whether or not with his eyes closed he could identify objects by feeling them, because he didn't have anything to feel them with. Though children can be trained to identify things by having them traced or pressed against the abdomen or between the shoulder blades.
But it doesn't restrict their memory of things.
Well, it restricts it, but
Not vision.
not visually, no, as long as he's got his eyes. And so much of our memory is visual, as a matter of fact, that losing sight is a major impairment. Though all things being equal, a blind person is better off than a deaf one. And because with deafness, language is impaired. And when language is impaired, the quality of the ability to abstract is greatly reduced. And you see, that's the door to everything. A deaf child is really a severe problem. And you take a case like Helen Keller, who is both deaf and blind, and then see how she rose to the figure that she did, of influence, of intellectual attainment, and so on, should convince anybody of the infinitude of potentialities in the human organism. Yes?
Yeah, but it's also true that she couldn't see and hear until she was about 2.
That's true.
That makes an awful lot of
Yeah, I'm sure it did. I suspect, though, if applying the knowledge we now have about it, if we got a child that was born blind and deaf, we would be able to do some things with it. And Pat was telling me last night of a new way of working with, is it blind babies, Pat? they have a little device that they put on the baby's forehead and put into the baby's ear. And this is a kind of a photoelectric cell. Have you read about it? And so when the baby turns its head and that there's something close, there is an auditory registration of that. So that the baby can even learn to play peekaboo with its mother auditorily by putting it on the mother and then turning the head and having the mother disappear because the photoelectric cell is not registering the nearness of an object. And then, so with all of this information, we'd be able to work around a lot of the difficulties a lot better than we could, say, 15 years ago. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the work of Brenda Milner, who is at Montreal Neurological Institute, and who is very interested in trying to solve the problem of epilepsy by ablating, which means destroying the small part of the brain where the epileptic seizure begins. There is a normal pattern of firing of these neurons. By firing, I mean the electrical charge is stored and then it's released. When, say, 85% of 14.5 billion neurons fires simultaneously, that creates enough of a difference in the electromagnetic field around the scalp that you can pick it up on a machine. Therefore, you can put electrodes on the brain, and you can then pick up on an oscilloscope a general biphasic wave, 14, 15 per second when you're awake. When you have a seizure, all hell breaks loose visually.